Summer of 1833, Horse Creek. Bearded men circled the fire. Nearly 300 trappers gathered where the creek met the Green River in what would someday be Wyoming. Annual rendezvous bringing them together like scattered wolves, forming a temporary pack. Air thick with wood smoke, whiskey fumes, the unmistakable stench of beaver pelts stacked in mounds waiting for the St. Louis caravan. Mountains of fur representing years' worth of brutal labor in conditions that broke weaker men. Samuel Hayes pulled his rifle from leather scabbard. Silence rippled through gathered trappers. Big Tom Walters spoke first. Pennsylvania mountain man standing 6'4", carrying Hawken rifle weighing 14 pounds, bored to .54 caliber, firing ball weighing over 200 grains. That's your bear gun? The question carried an edge of disbelief, almost mockery. Hayes's rifle looked delicate by comparison. Just over 9 pounds. Slender 36-inch barrel. Resembled Kentucky long rifles that had been popular back east. Fine for deer, maybe. Inadequate for grizzly. But what really drew laughter was what Big Tom had heard from the gunsmith that morning. 40 caliber. Jacob Morrison shook his head slowly. Son, that's a deer rifle. Maybe good for antelope if you're feeling bold. But a grizzly? Are you planning to annoy it to death? Laughter spread through gathered men like wildfire through dry grass. These were hard individuals. Survived winters that froze men solid. Indians who resented their presence. Encounters with animals weighing 800 pounds, possessing the temperament of Satan himself. They knew that when Grizzly charged, you needed stopping power. Needed rifle-throwing lead like cannon. Not a ball weighing barely half what their weapons fired. Samuel Hayes was 26 that summer, lean and weathered from 3 years in the mountains. Come west from Ohio in 1830. Apprenticed himself to a gunsmith in St. Louis. Learned his trade before heading into beaver country. Unlike most mountain men who couldn't read or write, Hayes had received education from his mother, school teacher who died when he was 12. He understood mathematics, trajectory, physics of how projectiles move through air and tissue. The path bringing Hayes to this moment, facing mockery from men whose respect he'd have to earn, began in the workshop of William Ogden back in St. Louis. Ogden was an immigrant from New York, established himself as one of finest rifle makers west of Mississippi. While most gunsmiths catered to the mountain man trade building heavy, robust rifles, Ogden held a different philosophy. The English shot-driven grouse at 60 yards, Ogden had told Hayes during apprenticeship, small birds moving fast, requiring precise aim and quick reactions. They use light shotguns they can swing smoothly. The principle applies to rifles. Weapons you can hold steady, aim precisely, fire without flinching will outperform heavy cannon in most shooters' hands. Hayes spent 18 months in Ogden's workshop, learning not just how to build rifles, but why certain design choices mattered. Barrel length affected accuracy and velocity. Twist rate of rifling determined how the ball stabilized in flight. The lock mechanism's geometry influenced trigger pull. Stock's dimensions affected how naturally the rifle pointed. Every detail mattered. Ogden insisted apprentices understand the reasoning behind each decision. When Hayes announced intention to join fur trade, Ogden offered to build a custom rifle. They spent weeks discussing specifications. Hayes wanted something he could carry all day without fatigue, something accurate enough for precise shooting, something reliable in harsh Rocky Mountain conditions. Result was 40 caliber rifle he now carried. Weapon representing everything Ogden had learned about precision rifle making. one that most mountain men considered inadequate for frontier life realities. "It's not about size of the ball," Hayes said quietly. "Not rising to bait. It's about where you place it." Big Tom snorted. "Place it? Listen to this one. Boy, when Grizzly's coming at you, you don't have time for placing anything. You point your rifle and pray that when you pull that trigger, you put enough lead into that monster to stop its heart before it stops yours." Statement wasn't wrong. In 1833, muzzle-loading rifle gave you one shot, maybe two if exceptionally fast, at reloading. Though no man was fast enough to reload before charging grizzly-covered distance between them. Reloading process told story of why mountain men wanted heavy calibers. First, pour powder down barrel from horn, measuring by eye or with charger. Then place greased patch over muzzle. Center lead ball on patch. Use ramrod to seat both firmly against powder charge. Finally, prime pan with fine powder. Close frizzen. Cock hammer. In ideal conditions, experienced shooter could reload in 30 seconds. Under pressure, with hands shaking and bear charging, that time doubled or tripled. Most trappers surviving grizzly attacks did so because they traveled in groups, or because bear decided fight wasn't worth trouble, or through sheer luck defying explanation. Conventional wisdom was brutally simple. You got one shot. Make it count by using biggest caliber that wouldn't dislocate your shoulder. Heaviest powder charge your barrel could safely handle. Wounded grizzly was more dangerous than unwounded one. Goal was delivering so much energy that even poorly placed shot would create shock and trauma. Hayes had heard the stories. Every man at Rendezvous knew about Hugh Glass, mauled and left for dead just 10 years earlier on Grand River. Glass survived. Crawled 200 miles to Fort Kiowa with broken leg, torn scalp, wounds so severe his ribs were exposed. His survival was miraculous, but his body bore scars serving as permanent reminder of what happened when man encountered grizzly on wrong terms. There were other stories. Men who'd fired point blank at charging bears only to have animals keep coming. Trappers who'd emptied rifles into grizzlies that seemed immune to lead. Tales of bears absorbing half-dozen shots before finally falling, even then remaining dangerous. Grizzly had earned reputation as most formidable predator in North America through countless encounters ending with human blood soaking into mountain soil. But Hayes had spent 3 years studying animals he hunted. Examined deer, elk, buffalo, and yes, even grizzlies other trappers had killed. Noted where vital organs sat. How bone density varied across different skeleton parts. Most importantly, learned that bears, despite size and ferocity, had same vulnerabilities as any other animal. Heart sat in chest cavity. Protected by ribs but accessible if you knew angles. Brain sat in skull. Protected by thick bone but with entry points that could be exploited from sides and rear. Spine ran down back controlling movement. Offering target that would drop any creature instantly if struck properly. He'd also studied aftermath of failed grizzly hunts. When 54 caliber ball hit bear in shoulder, it often stopped in heavy bone and muscle without reaching vital organs. Massive energy transfer created painful wound that enraged animal but didn't kill it. Shots to body cavity were effective only if they reached heart, lungs, or major blood vessels. Gut shots, common when shooting at moving target, condemned animal to slow death while leaving it perfectly capable of killing its attacker first. Difference between his rifle and heavy Hawkins most men carried wasn't just caliber, it was philosophy. Big rifles were designed for reliability and devastating impact. Load them with enough powder and even poor shot had chance of dealing catastrophic damage through sheer energy transfer. But they were heavy, slow to aim, produced tremendous recoil affecting accuracy, especially in high-pressure situations where accuracy mattered most. Hayes's .40 caliber rifle, custom built by William Ogden, weighed almost 5 pounds less than typical Hawken. Reduced weight meant he could hold it steady longer, track moving target more precisely, recover from recoil faster if he needed follow-up shot. Smaller powder charge, typically 60 grains compared to 120 grains most mountain men used, meant less flash, less smoke. Crucially, less flinch anticipation, ruining so many shots in critical moment before trigger broke. The 130-grain lead ball it fired lacked mass of .54 caliber projectile. True, but Hayes loaded it with precision-measured charges he'd tested extensively, used carefully selected linen patches cut to exact specifications, providing consistent fit, ensuring ball engaged rifling properly. He'd spent hours practicing fundamentals most trappers never bothered with, too busy actually trapping beaver to worry about marksmanship refinements. He knew his rifle's point of impact at 20 yards, 50 yards, 100 yards. Knew that at 50 yards, ball would drop approximately 3 inches below point of aim. Knew how wind from left or right would push ball off course. Roughly 1 inch per 5 miles per hour of wind at 50 yards. Knew how to adjust for shooting uphill or downhill. Understanding that effective range was horizontal distance, not actual distance to target. Most importantly, he trained himself to remain calm under pressure. Control his breathing. Squeeze trigger smoothly rather than jerking it in panic. Practice regimen Hayes had developed over 3 years was unlike anything most mountain men would consider. Every few days, when not actively trapping, he'd find suitable location, spend an hour shooting. Start with easy shots, paper targets at known distances from stable positions, then progress to difficult scenarios, shooting after running until heart pounded. Shooting at small targets at unknown distances, forcing himself to estimate range accurately. Shooting from awkward positions, kneeling on uneven ground or bracing against trees. Shooting at targets that moved, usually rocks he'd kicked down hillsides. He'd also practiced mental aspects of shooting under pressure. Imagine worst-case scenarios as vividly as possible. Charging bear mere seconds away. Friend's life depending on his accuracy. His own death inevitable if he missed. Then take the shot. See where it landed. Analyze what he'd done right or wrong. Over time, learn to compartmentalize fear. Let trained reflexes take over while conscious mind stayed calm and analytical. "You're going to get yourself killed, boy," Big Tom said. Tone shifting from mockery to something resembling genuine concern. "Pride's a fine thing, but it won't keep your guts from being spread across rocks when Grizzly gets hold of you." "I appreciate the worry," Hayes replied, "but I'll trust my shooting over sheer luck with heavy ball any day." Conversation would have ended there, filed away as another example of young man's foolishness, except for what happened 3 days later. Rendezvous of 1833 was held at confluence of Horse Creek and Green River. Broad valley surrounded by mountains holding snow even in July. Location chosen carefully. Valley provided good grass for hundreds of horses that had made journey, plentiful water from creek and river. Enough game to supplement supplies brought by caravan from St. Louis. Surrounding mountains offered protection from wind that could make camping miserable. Broad valley floor gave space for various camps to spread out. Nearly 500 people had gathered in that valley. Core group consisted of roughly 300 trappers, men who'd spent previous year working trap lines throughout Rocky Mountains. They'd traveled from Yellowstone country to north. From Snake River to west, from headwaters of Missouri, from countless smaller drainages where beaver were still plentiful, each man brought pelts he'd accumulated, typically 30 to 60 plues, as they called beaver skins, representing years' worth of hard labor in conditions that would have broken most civilized men. Trappers came in rough categories. There were company men employed by outfits like American Fur Company or Rocky Mountain Fur Company. These men received fixed wages, turned their pelts over to employers. Then there were free trappers, independent operators who worked for themselves, sold their furs to whichever company offered best price. Hayes was free trapper, which meant he bore all risks but kept all profits. Trading companies had sent representatives with pack trains loaded with supplies: sugar, coffee, tobacco, gunpowder, lead, blankets, knives, whiskey-made journey from St. Louis. Prices were outrageous, marked up 300 or 400%. But trappers had no choice. Pound of coffee costing 20 cents in St. Louis sold for $2 at Rendezvous. Gallon of whiskey worth 50 cents went for $5. Gunpowder was $3 per pound. Lead was $2 per pound. Decent blanket cost $15. But beaver pelts brought good prices too, typically $4 to $6 each. Successful trapper could make several $100s in a year. Fortune by 1830 standards. Shoshone and other tribes sent representatives bringing horses to trade, buffalo robes, decorated clothing made by their women. Rendezvous was one of few times when trappers, traders, and Indians mixed relatively peacefully, united by commercial interests binding them together. There were tensions, certainly. Violence occasionally erupted. But economic benefits kept most participants on good behavior. For trappers, Rendezvous was their one opportunity each year to trade furs, resupply, and most importantly, to socialize. These were men who spent 11 months of year in small groups or alone, working trap lines in isolation that could drive man mad. Rendezvous was where they reconnected with friends, shared stories, gambled, drank, fought, generally engaged in behavior that would have shocked folks back in settlements. On third day, after most serious trading had been completed, Shoshone Hunter came riding hard into camp, with news sending ripple of excitement through gathered men. Massive Grizzly had been spotted in stand of willows about 2 miles upstream, near meadow where Indians had been hunting elk. Bear had killed horse previous night, one of Shoshone's best animals. Carcass was drawing it back repeatedly. Several Shoshone warriors had tried to approach, retreated when they gotten close enough to see Bear's size. Big as any I've seen, Hunter reported through trapper who understood Shoshone language. Maybe 700, 800 pounds. Dark brown, almost black. Long claws. He held hands apart, demonstrating length. Spanning distance of roughly 4 inches. This is Bear that has killed before. You can see it in how he moves. Not afraid, angry. In different time or place, Bear report might have prompted caution. But this was Rendezvous, where whiskey flowed freely, and young men sought to prove themselves. Within an hour, a hunting party had formed. Big Tom Walters was going, of course. So were Morrison and half-dozen other experienced trappers. When Hayes announced he was joining, several men tried to talk him out of it. At least borrow a proper rifle, offered a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste. I got 56 caliber you can use. Give yourself a fighting chance? Hayes declined politely. I've trained with this rifle for 3 years. Switching now would be like learning to shoot all over again. I know how this one handles, how it shoots, where it hits at different ranges. Borrowed rifle, even bigger one, would be a step backward. It's your funeral, Baptiste said, shrugging. But he was smiling, as if he didn't entirely believe Hayes would actually face bear with his undersized rifle. Hunting party rode out late afternoon following Horse Creek upstream. A Shoshone hunter led way, reading landscapes with expertise that came from a lifetime in these mountains. The creek flowed through a mix of terrain, open meadows alternating with thick stands of willow and cottonwood. Bears favored dense cover where they could rest during day, emerge at dusk to feed. They found sign quickly. The bear had left a trail even inexperienced trappers could follow. Massive paw prints pressed deep into soft earth near water, each print showing 5 toes and distinctive claw marks, identifying it as a grizzly rather than less dangerous black bear. Prints measured nearly 10 inches long and 8 inches wide, suggesting animal at the upper end of size range for grizzlies in this region. As they followed the trail, the Shoshone hunter pointed out other signs. Trees where bear had rubbed its back, leaving tufts of coarse fur caught in bark at heights suggesting massive size. Claw marks on tree trunks scored deep into wood at levels well above man's head. Fresh scat, dark and loose, indicating the bear had been feeding on meat rather than berries or roots. Droppings contained horsehair. Confirmation this was indeed the animal that killed Shoshone's horse. Hunters dismounted 100 yards from where Shoshone hunters indicated the bear was likely bedded down. Standard procedure. Horses panicked when they scented bears. Panicked horses could alert an animal or bolt with critical supplies. They tied horses securely to trees, triple-checking knots, then checked weapons methodically. This was a ritual separating living trappers from dead ones. Each man examined his rifle's priming powder, ensuring it was fresh and dry, checked that patches and balls were readily accessible. Verified powder horns were full and powder would flow freely. Several men carried backup pistols, though everyone knew pistols were of limited use against grizzlies. Flintlock mechanisms required careful attention. Dirty frizzes wouldn't spark properly. Dull flint wouldn't create sufficient spark to ignite priming powder. Any moisture could turn powder into useless paste. Hayes went through his own preparations with practiced efficiency. His rifle's lock was clean and recently oiled. Frizzen had been freshly napped, presenting a sharp edge that would produce maximum spark. His powder horn contained fresh powder he'd kept dry by sealing with wax. His possibles bag held 24 pre-cut patches, an equal number of cast balls, each one carefully inspected for defects before being loaded. He had backup flints, wrapped in soft leather, spare nipple pick for clearing touch hole, small tin of grease for lubricating patches. Hunt was about to begin. But Hayes took one additional step others didn't. He loaded his rifle with meticulous care, ensuring everything was exactly as it should be. Measured 60 grains of powder precisely using a brass charger rather than estimating. Selected patch showing no thin spots or tears. Greased it evenly. Centered the ball perfectly. As he seated charge with a ramrod, he counted strokes, ensuring he'd pushed the ball down to exactly the same position every time. Consistency mattered. Balls seated too loosely would be inaccurate. One seated too firmly could lead to excessive pressure and burst the barrel. Big Tom watched this process with growing impatience. "Boy, we don't have time for this. That bear could be moving." "Better to take 30 extra seconds now than miss the shot when it matters," Hayes replied calmly. Continuing his loading routine without rushing, he primed the pan with fine powder, closed the frizzen, set the hammer at half-cock, safety position, preventing accidental discharge. Only then did he look up and nod that he was ready. Plan was simple, as most hunting plans were. They would spread out in rough semicircle, approaching willows from multiple angles. try to spot the bear before it spotted them. Whoever had best shot would take it. If the bear charged, they'd all fire, hoping concentrated fire would bring it down before it reached anyone. In theory, 8 rifles provided redundancy. In practice, everyone knew panic shooting often meant panic missing. They moved through meadow grass quietly, each man spacing himself 20 yards from neighbors. Hayes positioned himself on the far left of the line. Deliberate choice. The prevailing wind was from the west. He wanted to be downwind of the bear if possible. Most animals relied heavily on scent. Approaching from downwind reduced the chance of early detection. Sound plan. Might have worked. But hunting rarely goes according to plan. What actually happened was the bear wasn't sleeping in the willows where they expected. It had already emerged. Was making its way back toward the horse carcass, approaching from upstream and upwind of hunters. The animal's route brought it through a shallow ravine, concealing its movement until it was almost on top of them. The first warning came when Big Tom's horse screamed. The sound was primal, shrill whinny speaking of absolute terror. The animal had caught the bear's scent on the wind. Despite being tied securely, it managed to break its tether through sheer, panic-driven strength. It bolted across the meadow, running blind. In doing so, attracted the attention of every predator within earshot, including Grizzly. The bear emerged from the ravine at full run. 750 pounds of muscle, fur, and fury exploded into view with shocking suddenness. Bears looked lumbering from a distance, almost comical in their bulk. But at close range they move like avalanches, covering ground at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour. The animal's small eyes fixed on the nearest human form, which happened to be Jacob Morrison. Morrison had been checking his rifle's priming when the horse bolted, looked up to see what caused the commotion, found himself staring at the charging Grizzly from a distance of perhaps 40 yards. Bear was closing that distance at a rate of roughly 13 yards per second, giving Morrison approximately 3 seconds to react. He got his rifle up. Heavy Hawken came to shoulder in smooth motion, born of long practice. His thumb cocked the hammer as stock met cheek. Front sight found Bear's chest as finger found trigger. He fired, missed completely. A shot taken in panic with a heavy rifle, while moving backward, went high and right. Ball passed over the bear's shoulder by a margin of several feet, buried itself in the hillside beyond. Morrison dropped the useless rifle and ran, screaming for help, his mind no longer processing tactical considerations, operating on pure survival instinct. Bear's response to the shot was typical for a grizzly. It didn't slow down. Some animals flee from gunfire, others pause trying to locate the noise source. Grizzlies, particularly mature ones, surviving previous encounters with humans, often interpret gunfire as challenge rather than threat. They charge harder. Big Tom fired next. His shot was better aimed, striking Bear in upper shoulder. Heavy .54 caliber ball, backed by 130 grains of powder, delivered approximately 2,000 foot-pounds of energy on impact, equivalent to being hit with a sledgehammer. The bear staggered momentarily, front legs buckling slightly as impact registered. But grizzly bears have shoulder bones like oak planks, muscles layered so densely they can absorb impacts that would drop most animals. The ball penetrated the outer muscle, but stopped against the scapula bone, failing to reach the chest cavity where vital organs resided. The wound was certainly painful, would eventually prove serious if left untreated, but it wasn't immediately incapacitating. Bear roared. Sound was like nothing else in nature, deep bellow that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, the sound that turned men's blood to ice, made their hands shake. Then the bear resumed its charge. now enraged as well as aggressive. Focused entirely on Morrison running for his life across open meadow. Two more shots rang out in quick succession. One missed entirely, shooter having jerked trigger in panic. Others hit the bear in hindquarters. Drawing blood but failing to slow charge, the ball clipped a heavy muscle of the rear leg, causing pain but not structural damage. If anything, the wound seemed to make the bear faster. Adrenaline overriding any damage signals from the nervous system. This was mathematics of frontier survival, playing out in real time. 4 rifles fired, 3 hits, none stopping the bear, 4 men now holding useless weapons that would take 45 seconds minimum to reload. 1 man running for his life. 1 grizzly that had absorbed 3 lead balls without significant effect. Bear was now 15 yards from Morrison and closing fast. Hayes had moved to the side when chaos started, circling wide while other hunters focused on protecting Morrison. Movement was instinctive, based on hours of mental preparation for exactly this type of scenario. While everyone else's attention had tunneled onto immediate threat, Hayes had maintained enough tactical awareness to position himself for flanking shots. It gave him an angle. Clear line of sight to Bear's left profile as it charged. Most importantly, it gave him time. Perhaps 5 seconds while the bear was focused entirely on Morrison and other hunters were fumbling to reload or standing frozen in shock. 5 seconds was enough if he could make them count. Hayes dropped to one knee, bracing left elbow on left knee in position, providing maximum stability. Rifle came up smoothly. Movement practiced so many times it required no conscious thought. The left hand supported the forestock at point, balancing the weapon's weight perfectly. Right hand gripped wrist of stock. Trigger finger extended alongside trigger guard as he brought rifle to shoulder. Front sight, small brass blade, came into alignment with notched rear sight. Hayes's eye tracked the bear as it moved, sight picture following smoothly. His breathing slowed automatically. Unconscious response to focused concentration. Heart rate dropped even as the body flooded with adrenaline. Paradox that only extensive training could produce. The front sight settled on a point just behind the bear's ear. This was shot Hayes had visualized hundreds of times during practice sessions. Scenario that had driven his choice of rifle and training regimen. The bear's skull presented a complex target. From the front, bone was too thick for reliable penetration. From above, the cranium's crown was similarly protected. But from the side, where the temporal bone joined the occipital bone behind the ear, there was a thinner section offering access to the brain cavity. The brain itself was small, perhaps the size of 2 fists pressed together, suspended in cerebral spinal fluid within the skull. A shot that merely grazed the skull's exterior would wound but not kill. A shot that entered the skull but missed brain tissue might pass through empty space, causing shock but not immediate death. Only a shot that actually struck brain tissue itself would produce instant incapacitation. Hayes knew all of this. He'd studied anatomy during apprenticeship. Examining skulls Ogden kept in the workshop for reference, measured distances, calculated angles, determined the optimal point of aim. Now, with Morrison's life depending on his accuracy and his own life forfeit if he missed, all that preparation came down to single trigger press. The distance was 40 yards. Impossible shot by any reasonable standard. Moving target under pressure that would make most men's hands shake uncontrollably. But Hayes had practiced at this distance hundreds of times, stood in mountain meadows shooting at pine cones, at knots in trees, at anything that would teach his muscles and mind to work together. Developed instinctive understanding of trajectory, of how to lead a moving target, of how to time the trigger broke at a precise moment when everything aligned. His finger moved from alongside the trigger guard to trigger itself. Pressure increased gradually, smoothly. No sudden jerk that would pull sights off target. Hammer fell. Flint struck the frizzen. Sparks showered into priming powder. The main charge ignited with a roar and cloud of white smoke. 40 caliber ball weighing 130 grains, traveling at approximately 1,500 feet per second, crossed 40 yards of mountain air in less than 1/10 of a second. It struck the bear precisely where Hayes had aimed, just behind the left ear at the point where temporal bone was thinnest. The ball penetrated the skull, passed through a thin layer of cerebral spinal fluid, entered brain tissue. Hydrostatic shock waves created by projectile, traveling faster than speed of sound through fluid-filled tissue, radiated outward from the wound channel. Brain tissue, controlling every body function from breathing to movement to consciousness itself, ceased operating instantly. Grizzly dropped as if someone had cut its strings. One moment it was the force of nature, 800 pounds of unstoppable momentum carrying it toward Morrison. Next, it collapsed mid-stride, legs ceasing to receive signals from the brain that no longer functioned. Bear's forward momentum carried it into somersault. Massive body tumbling across grass before coming to rest in an ungainly heap. The silence that followed was profound. Morrison stood frozen 10 yards from where the bear had fallen, chest heaving, mind unable to process what had just happened. 1 second he'd been running for his life, certain he was about to die. Next, the threat had simply ceased to exist. Big Tom walked forward slowly, empty rifle held loosely in one hand, eyes fixed on fallen Grizzly. He approached cautiously, watching for any sign of movement. But the bear was clearly dead. The animal's eyes were open but unseeing, tongue protruding slightly from mouth. No breathing movement disturbed massive chest. Other hunters emerged from their positions, converging on scene with expressions mixing relief, shock, and disbelief. Several were still attempting to reload rifles with shaking hands, their minds not yet processing that danger had passed. Hayes remained where he'd been, still kneeling, rifle now resting across thighs. His hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline finally catching up with him. He'd killed the bear, but the weight of how close Morrison had come to death was settling on him like a physical burden. 3 or 4 more seconds, and the bear would have reached Morrison. No amount of shooting could have stopped what would have followed. "Where'd you hit it?" Big Tom's voice was quiet, almost reverent. The big man knelt beside the fallen Grizzly, examining the animal with the eye of someone who'd seen many dead bears. Hayes gestured toward the bear's head. Behind the ear, skull's thinner there. Gives access to the brain cavity. Big Tom examined the wound carefully. The entrance hole was small, barely visible in thick fur. He felt along Bear's skull with experienced hands, tracing bone structure, until he found the entry point. Ball had entered exactly where Hayes indicated. In the section of skull perhaps 1/2 inch thick, compared to 2-inch thickness of frontal bone. 40 yards, Big Tom said slowly, as if trying to convince himself of what he'd witnessed. Moving target. You put a ball through the skull the size of my palm. He looked up at Hayes with an expression entirely different from the mockery of 3 days earlier. Boy, that wasn't luck. That was the finest shot I've ever seen. And I've seen plenty. Examination continued as more hunters gathered around fallen Grizzly. They found 3 previous hits, each one telling its own story about frontier combat realities. Big Tom's shot had struck shoulder, penetrating perhaps 4 inches before stopping against heavy scapula bone. The shot had caused a serious wound that would have eventually killed the bear through blood loss and infection, but eventually meant hours or days, not seconds. In the charging situation, it had been effectively useless. The shot that hit hindquarters had barely slowed the bear at all. The ball clipped the heavy muscle of the rear leg but missed bone entirely. Flesh wound. Painful but not debilitating. Bear would have ignored it completely in the heat of combat. The shoulder shot, Hayes explained later once they'd begun the field dressing process. That's what everyone aims for. Center mass. Biggest target. Works most times if you're shooting at a game, standing still, or moving slowly. But the Grizzly's got bones and muscles in the shoulder that can stop the ball cold. I've seen it before. Seen balls recovered from dead bears that stopped in the shoulder without reaching the chest cavity. So you aim for the head, Big Tom said. Not a question. Statement seeking confirmation, not just head. Right part of head from right angle. A frontal shot at a grizzly skull is asking for trouble. That frontal bone's too thick, especially on mature animals. I've heard stories of balls deflecting off the forehead, skittering along the skull without penetrating. But from the side, if you know where to place it, you can reach the brain. One shot, instant death. Bear doesn't know what happened. Just stops like cutting strings. Field dressing process revealed more about the bear's anatomy and effectiveness, or lack thereof, of previous shots. The shoulder wound had created a cavity of destroyed muscle, approximately 3 inches in diameter. Ball had transferred its energy into tissue, creating a temporary wound cavity larger than the projectile itself. But heavy bones stopped the ball's forward progress completely. If the bear had survived, this wound would have become infected within days, eventually killing the animal. But in the immediate term, it merely enraged the already dangerous creature. The hindquarter wound was even less effective. The ball passed clean through muscle, entering and exiting without striking bone. The wound channel was relatively small. While it caused bleeding, it hadn't damaged any major blood vessels. Deer or elk might have been significantly hampered by such wounds. Grizzly barely noticed. Hayes's shot, by contrast, had caused instant cessation of all life functions. Brain damage was catastrophic and irreversible. No suffering, no extended chase, no dangerous wounded animal that might circle back to attack later. Just immediate, complete death. They hauled the bear back to camp as the sun was setting. The process required 8 men and nearly 2 hours of work. A grizzly of that size doesn't move easily even when dead. They gutted it first, removing internal organs to reduce weight. Then fashioned travois from pine poles and leather ropes. Even gutted, the bear weighed well over 600 pounds. Word of what happened spread through Rendezvous faster than fire through dry grass. By the time they arrived at the main camp, several hundred people had gathered to see the bear and hear the story. Hide was spread out for inspection. Men pressed forward to touch it. See length of claws. Examine the skull wound that killed it. Maybe 7 feet nose to tail. Someone measured with rope. Claws 4 inches long. Look at the teeth on this one. Canine teeth measured nearly 2 inches. Designed for gripping and tearing. Grinding molars at the back of the jaw were massive, capable of crushing bone. But what captured everyone's attention was the story of the shot itself. 40 yards, they said. Passing tail from one campfire to another, moving target. Dropped it dead with a .40 caliber rifle most men had dismissed as inadequate. The man who had taken the shot was that young fellow Hayes, one from Ohio who'd been working trap lines up near Yellowstone country. That night, gathered around campfires throughout the valley, The story was told and retold. Each telling added slightly different details, as stories always do, but the core remained constant. Hayes had made the shot most men considered impossible. Under pressure, that would have paralyzed most shooters. With a rifle, others had mocked as insufficient. Hayes found himself surrounded by trappers wanting to understand his approach. The conversation went deep into the night, covering everything from powder charges to anatomy to practice techniques. He explained how he'd developed his loading procedure, measuring powder by weight rather than volume to ensure consistency. Demonstrated how he cut patches to precise dimensions, ensuring uniform fit and engagement with rifling. Described his practice regimen. Hundreds of shots taken at various distances under various conditions. But how do you stay calm when bears charging? Someone asked, getting to heart of what everyone wanted to know. Practice doesn't make perfect, Hayes replied. It makes permanent. I spent 3 years training myself to react calmly under pressure. Every time I practiced, I'd imagine the worst-case scenario. Charging bear. Friend's life at stake. My own death is certain if I missed. Then I'd take a shot and analyze the result. After enough repetitions, staying calm became automatic. My body knew what to do even when my mind wanted to panic. Have you ever missed? Big Tom asked, genuinely curious. In practice? All the time, especially when I was learning. But each miss taught me something. Maybe I jerked the trigger. Maybe I didn't account for wind. Maybe misjudged distance. I'd analyze what went wrong and adjust. Over time, misses became less frequent. Hayes paused, staring into fire. In actual hunting situations, I've missed once, 2 years ago. Bull elk at about 70 yards. Forgot to account for uphill angle. Shot high. But that was a game, not a life or death situation. I learned from it. An older trapper named Samuel Worth spoke up. Man who'd been in the mountains since before the Rendezvous system started. Son, I've seen a lot of men killed by grizzlies over the years. Some had big rifles, some had small, some were good shots, some were poor. You know what I've noticed? Men who survive are ones who stay calm, ones who can think when everyone else is panicking. That's what you did today. Rifle helped, sure, but it was your mind that saved Morrison's life. Conversation continued for hours, covering topics ranging far beyond immediate incident. They discussed the decline of the beaver trade, which everyone could see coming. Beaver hats going out of fashion back east, replaced by silk. The number of trappers increasing while number of beaver declining. Simple economics meant trade couldn't last much longer. They talked about Indians whose tolerance for trappers was wearing thin, as more whites entered their traditional territories. Discussed alternative ways to make living in mountains, from guiding settlers to hunting buffalo for hides. The world was changing. Everyone gathered around those campfires knew the mountain man era was nearing its end. But through all these discussions, the topic kept returning to that single shot that dropped the charging grizzly. It represented something more than just good marksmanship. Symbolized idea that skill and knowledge could overcome what everyone assumed were insurmountable obstacles. That careful preparation and disciplined practice could make impossible possible. The morning after the bear hunt, Hayes was approached by Jim Bridger himself, one of the most respected men in the mountains. Bridger was just 29 years old, but already legendary for his knowledge of Rockies and survival skills. He'd been examining Hayes's rifle, wanted to talk privately. Ogden built this? Bridger asked. Running hand along rifle's sleek lines. Stock was curly maple, beautifully grained but not ornately carved. Metalwork was functional rather than decorative. Clearly a working rifle, not a showpiece. "Yes, sir." "Custom order." I told him what I needed. He built it to specification. It took him 6 weeks. Bridger sighted down barrel, testing balance. The rifle came to his shoulder naturally, pointing where he looked without conscious adjustment. It's a fine piece of work, light enough to carry all day without fatigue, balanced for quick aiming, accurate enough for precise shots. I can see the value. He lowered the rifle, looked at Hayes directly. "But I'm going to tell you something. I want you to listen carefully." "Yes, sir. What you did yesterday was impressive. No question. Saved Morrison's life. Demonstrated skills most men don't possess. But it was also dangerous, not just to you, but to everyone in that hunting party. If you'd missed that shot, Morrison was dead. Maybe you too when that bear finished with him and came looking for next target. Maybe others because a wounded, enraged grizzly in the middle of a group of men with empty rifles is everyone's nightmare." Hayes met Bridger's eyes steadily. "I understand that, sir. But I didn't miss it. And the reason I didn't miss it is because I've trained for exactly that situation for 3 years. This time you didn't miss. What about next time? Or time after that? Every man's luck runs out eventually." Bridger handed the rifle back. "I'm not saying your approach is wrong. I'm saying you need to understand the weight of responsibility that comes with it. When you're hunting alone, you risk only yourself. But when you're with a group, everyone's lives are interconnected. One man's failure can kill multiple people." "Fair point." Hayes acknowledged it. "You're right, sir. I should have considered that. If I hunt with groups in future, I'll make sure everyone understands my approach and agrees with it beforehand. Won't assume they're comfortable with my methods just because I am." Bridger nodded, seemingly satisfied. "You've got confidence. You've earned it through hard work. Just make sure it doesn't become arrogance. Mountains have a way of humbling proud men. Lessons they teach are often fatal. I'll remember that, sir." "Good." Bridger paused, then smiled slightly. "That said, it was a hell of a shot. Finest I've ever witnessed. I've seen some shooters in my time. Keep practicing. Keep learning. Maybe you'll have a long career in these mountains." The rest of the 1833 rendezvous continued for another week. Hayes found his reputation transformed. Men who'd laughed at his .40 caliber rifle 3 days earlier now asked to examine it, feel its balance, understand how it worked. Several trappers commissioned similar rifles to be built when the supply caravan returned to St. Louis. Others stuck with their heavy Hawkins but started practicing precision shooting techniques Hayes advocated. Grizzly hide became a highly valued item. Once properly tanned, stretched, and cleaned, it measured an impressive 7 feet from nose to tail. The fur was thick and dark, almost black in certain light, indicating old, healthy animal. When Hayes put it up for trade, the Shoshone chief offered 3 horses for it. Extraordinary price reflecting both hide's quality and story attached to it. Hayes accepted. Horses were worth far more than money in the mountains. They provided transportation, allowing trappers to cover more territory. Could carry supplies and furs, increasing efficiency. In emergencies, they could be eaten, providing food when game was scarce. 3 horses represented wealth and security. But more valuable than horses was the transformation in how other trappers viewed Hayes. He was no longer a young fool with a toy rifle. He was a man who'd made an impossible shot when it mattered most, who'd stayed calm under pressure, who'd proven that skill could overcome supposed advantages of brute force. The story of the grizzly hunt spread beyond the 1833 rendezvous. carried by trappers as they dispersed to various trapping territories, told at trading posts, at subsequent rendezvous gatherings, in mining camps and frontier settlements. Details changed with each retelling, as stories inevitably do. Some versions had the bear weighing 1,000 pounds. Others had Hayes making the shot at 100 yards. But the core truth remained, confirmed by multiple witnesses. A young trapper with a small caliber rifle had accomplished something most men thought impossible. Years that followed demonstrated the lasting impact of that single shot. Hayes continued trapping until 1838, when the beaver trade finally collapsed. Most mountain men had to find new livelihoods. He'd survived 8 years in some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. Including 2 more Grizzly encounters, he ended with precisely placed shots from his .40 caliber rifle. Neither incident gained fame of that first hunt at the 1833 rendezvous, but they confirmed the shot hadn't been luck. More significantly, Hayes's approach influenced the generation of hunters who came after him. Heavy hawking certainly remained popular, but the idea that shot placement mattered more than caliber size became accepted wisdom. As firearms technology improved through the rest of the 19th century, with development of breech-loading weapons, metallic cartridges, and more accurate rifling, the advantage of precision over power became even more pronounced. The grizzly bear population in the Rockies declined through the rest of the 19th century. By 1900, grizzlies had been eliminated from most of their historic range in western United States. Today, they survive in lower 48 states, only in isolated populations in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Washington. Protected by federal law, days when man could encounter charging grizzly while hunting in these mountains have largely passed. But in 1833 at Horse Creek near Green River, a young man with a rifle most veterans considered inadequate had demonstrated something transcending hunting technique. He'd shown that knowledge, discipline, and precise skill could overcome raw power. That staying calm under pressure mattered more than having the biggest weapon. That understanding of your tools and your target's anatomy could turn supposed disadvantage into actual advantage. Bearded men who'd laughed at that .40 caliber rifle 3 days before the hunt never laughed again. Instead, they told the story of Samuel Hayes and his impossible shot. Story that became part of mountain man lore, remained in circulation long after the last beaver pelt was traded and rendezvous system ended. Somewhere in a museum or private collection today, that .40 caliber rifle still exists. Reminder of the era when men ventured into unmapped territory with nothing but their skills and weapons to keep them alive. When one man proved that expertise with chosen tools matters more than having the most powerful option available. The shot heard at Horse Creek didn't just kill the bear, it killed the assumption that bigger always meant better. That raw power trumped precision. That conventional wisdom couldn't be challenged by someone willing to think differently and train accordingly. Hayes never became famous outside mountain man circles, never wrote books, never sought recognition. He simply lived his life, applied his skills, survived when others didn't. And in doing so, proved that sometimes the underestimated weapon in skilled hands is deadlier than overpowered weapon in shaking ones. Sometimes the fool who brings a light rifle is the only one who makes the shot that matters. Sometimes preparation and discipline beat tradition and brute force. That lesson echoed through frontier history, long after Samuel Hayes hung up his rifle and settled into quiet life back in Ohio. The young man who'd been mocked became a legend, not because he sought it, but because he demonstrated the truth that survival demanded more than just carrying the biggest gun. It demanded knowing how to use what you carried better than anyone else. And when the moment came, when bears charged and lives hung in balance, that knowledge made all the difference. One shot, 40 yards, moving target. The impossible made possible through 3 years of practice nobody saw, through discipline nobody appreciated, through understanding nobody valued, until the day it saved a life.